You know, the Bible, it's arguably one of the most influential books in all of human history. But here's the thing, it didn't just poof appear out of thin air. The truth is, it was written and edited and assembled by many different people over hundreds and hundreds of years. So today, we're going to pull back the curtain on that fascinating and, yeah, sometimes kind of messy human story. Okay, let's just dive right in with a puzzle. Check this out. On the one hand, in the book of Genesis, you get this picture of God who is so personal, he's literally taking a stroll through the Garden of Eden. But then you flip over to Deuteronomy and you get the complete opposite. The text is emphatic. You saw no form. There was only a voice. So, what gives? Which one is it? Is this just a mistake? And that right there, that's the central puzzle we're going to solve today. Because here's the secret. These aren't mistakes, not at all. They're actually clues. Think of them like fingerprints left behind by different authors from different time periods who all had their own unique ways of understanding God and the world. So, here's our roadmap for cracking this case. First, we'll look at these contradictions as vital clues. Then, we'll meet the four main voices behind the Torah. We'll see how Israel's history actually got rewritten, we'll figure out who stitched it all together, and finally, we'll talk about what this all means for how we read the text today. All right, so let's start with those contradictions. The trick is to stop seeing them as problems or errors. Instead, think of them the way scholars do, as seams. You know, like the stitching in a quilt. They show you exactly where different ancient documents were carefully woven together to create the single text we have now. So, if the Bible is stitched together from all these different documents, you gotta ask who wrote them. Well, that brings us to our next big clue. What scholars call the four voices of the Torah, the distinct authors behind those first 5 books of the Bible. And the key to understanding all of this is a really powerful idea called the documentary hypothesis. It's a game changer. It suggests that the Torah, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and so on, isn't the work of a single author, like Moses. Instead, it's this brilliant tapestry woven together from at least 4 major, one-separate sources, each with its own style and its own perspective. So let's meet the crew. Scholars have given them these handy nicknames: J, E, P, and D. Think of J as the storyteller. This author is vivid, and their God is very human-like. E is the theologian, a bit more distant, whose God often communicates through dreams. Then you've got P, the priest, who is all about structure, laws, and order. And finally, D, the preacher, whose voice is just full of passion. Let's hear how different they really sound. All right, here's the J source, the storyteller. Remember the God who walks in the garden? That's classic J. And look at this. God is literally sewing clothes for Adam and Eve. It's so personal, so hands-on, kind of like a parent. It's a really vivid, human-like, or anthropomorphic picture of God. Now let's switch gears to the E source, in Jacob's famous dream about the ladder. Notice the difference here? God isn't there in person. The communication is indirect. It happens through a dream, with angels as intermediaries. This God feels more transcendent, a little more removed from the day-to-day human world. And now for P, the priestly source. Whoa, the tone shifts completely, doesn't it? It's formal, it's majestic, really orderly. God speaks in these grand commands and covenants. The P source is all about the big picture, genealogies, laws, and the fundamental structure of society. And finally, D, the preacher. You find this voice almost entirely in the book of Deuteronomy, and man, is it passionate. It reads like a sermon, just fiery and urgent, demanding absolute loyalty to one God. A God who, importantly, is unseen and speaks only through words. And ding, 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 this is the source that gave us that no form, only a voice contradiction we saw at the very beginning. The puzzle pieces are starting to fit. Now, this whole idea of layering different voices doesn't just stop with the Torah. It keeps going. As we're about to see, you find the same thing happening in the historical books, where you have different authors who are basically rewriting Israel's history to make a specific theological point. Essentially, scholars have identified 2 big competing histories of ancient Israel. First, you've got what's called the Deuteronomistic history, which covers the books from Joshua all the way to Kings. And then you have the Chronicler's history, which retells a lot of that same story in the books of Chronicles, but with some major changes. A perfect case study is the story of King Manasseh. In the book of Kings, he's described as the most evil king Judah ever had, period. But
He also had a very long, very prosperous 55-year reign. Now, for the author of Kings, that wasn't a problem. But for a later author, the one we call the chronicler, this presented a massive theological issue.
You see, the chronicler was working with a different worldview, what scholars call retribution theology. This is the idea that God rewards the good and punishes the wicked right now in this life. An evil king having a long, successful reign just didn't compute. It broke the rules. So the chronicler rewrote the story. He added a whole new scene where Manasseh repents, gets forgiven by God, and is then restored to his throne. And just like that, problem solved.
Okay, this raises a huge question. If you've got all these different authors with different styles and even competing histories, who on earth put them all together in one book? Well, that brings us to the next part of our story, the Great Redaction. The answer is a group of people we called redactors. These were the ancient editors. But, and this is the most important part, they weren't like modern editors. A modern editor would smooth out all the contradictions to make everything consistent. These redactors did the exact opposite. Their goal was preservation. They wanted to save all the sacred traditions of their people, even when those traditions disagreed. Their job wasn't to create a perfect harmony, it was to save the entire orchestra. And as you can see, this was a process that unfolded over centuries. The earliest sources were written as far back as 950 BCE, but the final weaving, the big one that brought these major sources together into the Torah we know, that likely happened much later, during a period of intense national crisis, the Babylonian exile. I mean, think about it. Their temple was destroyed, their people were scattered. Preserving their collective memory, all of it, became an urgent act of survival.
So, what does this all mean for us? That brings us to our final stop. How does knowing this complex history change the way we actually read the Bible today?
Well, it means we have to stop thinking of the Bible as a flat book with a single monotone voice. Instead, we can see it for what it truly is, a library. It's a rich tapestry. It's a vibrant, and yeah, sometimes even argumentative, conversation between different voices that's been happening across hundreds of years. So here's a challenge for you. The next time you sit down to read, try this. Look for those different voices. When you hit a passage, ask yourself, wait, who's talking right now? Is this the vivid storyteller, the distant theologian, the orderly priest, or the passionate preacher? When you start to appreciate the text as a conversation, it's key to a much deeper understanding. Because in the end, the Bible isn't just a book of answers. It's a record of a centuries-long conversation about life's biggest questions. And the real takeaway is this. Now that you've been invited into that conversation, what new questions will you ask?